Welcome back to Mrs. Beth's Book Club. That's what I'll call it today, anyway. We were reading last time I saw you, Scar Island. We read the first chapter, and it was called, what was it called? It was called A Dark Place Indeed. And our main character, Jonathan Grimsby, was on his way to the reform school on this island with these creepy kind of a captain on board, taking him, and he was dropped off and pulled inside by this skeletal creature. And I was remembering I asked you to think about the strongest prisons of all are the ones we build for ourselves. So anyway, this one that it's talking about at the front of the book, the prisons we build for ourselves, is something in our own minds, something that we think about that keeps us a prisoner of who we are. But here, we have this boy going to what seems like to be a very real place, not something in his mind. But there's something in his mind that's going on as well. But anyway, here we go. Continuing, he has been pulled in by this skeletal man and a very tall, thin man into this castle-type prison reform school. Chapter 2, it is called The Sinner's Sorrow. The pain was burning up from Jonathan's knees like hot white fire. Sweat crawled down his back and he bit his tongue to keep from crying out. He was kneeling on a dark wood contraption in the Admiral's office, facing the Admiral's desk. He'd been ordered to kneel there as soon as he was ushered in, and the Admiral hadn't looked up from the papers on his desk since. The Admiral's office smelled of waxy candles, sweat, chocolate, and a vague whiff of alcohol. It wasn't a pleasant mix, and combined with the heat of the room and the sharp ache in his knees, it was enough to make Jonathan want to throw up. His shoulders were burning from being twisted back into the handcuffs after he changed into a drab uniform, and his stomach clenched with hunger. He'd gone from shivering in the boat to sweating in the stuffy heat of the Admiral's office. The one-piece gray garment he'd been given was stained and threadbare, and it stretched from his neck to his ankles like a prison uniform. He blew his hair out of his eyes and tried to keep his arms from going numb. The Admiral sat behind a huge desk made of dark, shiny wood. His thin hair was mostly gray and was slicked down across his head with some kind of oily grease. His nose was the size and shape of an eagle's beak, and above were two shiny eyes, black as olives. They looked too small for the rest of his face. His eyebrows looked like two monstrous bushy cockroaches crouched on his forehead. A patchy shadow of stubbly whiskers grew on his cheeks and chin. He was wearing a dark blue uniform jacket with fancy brass buttons like they wore in the Navy. It might have fit him when he was younger, but now his neck fat squeezed over the top button of the collar and his belly bulged out from under the bottom three buttons, which were undone. He sat shuffling through some paper, sipping from a glass of brown liquid and stuffing chocolates into his mouth. A crinkly pile of shiny gold wrappers grew by his elbow with each chocolate he devoured. A blond-haired boy, a little older than Jonathan, and kind of chubby, stood in the corner with his hands crossed in front of him. He was watching the Admiral with eager eyes, and from time to time shot a smug smirk Jonathan's way. He looked like a teacher's pet, but the kind that bites. The only light came from 10 or 11 tall white candles, flickering here and there from brass holders around the room. "Brandy?" the Admiral said at last. His voice was deep and breathy like a dragon's. The boy in the corner sprang forward. He pulled a bottle from the shelf and poured another splash of brown liquid into the Admiral's glass. The Admiral didn't move except to exhale and raise one of his cockroach eyebrows. The kid frantically reopened the bottle and sloshed more brandy into the glass. The Admiral scowled and smacked his lips, but picked up the glass and took a loud, slurping sip. The kid returned the bottle to the shelf and scurried back to his corner. "Jonathan Grisby," the Admiral finally said. He said Jonathan's name the way most people might say the word diarrhea. Jonathan swallowed. "Yeah." The Admiral's glass froze halfway to his mouth. His eyes slid to the kid in the corner and then back to Jonathan. The kid practically ran over to Jonathan, then leaned down to hiss in his ear. "You gotta call him Sir or Admiral, dummy." "What? Sir? Call him Sir." The kid retreated back to his corner and the Admiral set down his glass. "Jonathan Grisby," he said again. The whole room seemed to wait. "Yes," Jonathan replied. Then, "Sir." The Admiral smiled with half his mouth. He tapped the papers with his finger. "This is a terrible crime you've committed, Jonathan Grisby." Jonathan didn't answer. "I suppose you, like most criminals, insist you are innocent." "No," Jonathan replied quietly, his eyes downcast. "I did it, sir." I see. Unapologetic, unashamed. No lesson learned yet, then." The Admiral's face twisted into another half smile. "It will be learned, though, it will. We have wonderful ways of teaching you lessons." He took another wet sip of his brandy and swished the alcohol around his mouth. Jonathan swallowed a deep breath. He felt a warm bead of sweat down his forehead. With a grunting sigh, the Admiral rose to his feet and slumped around the desk to where Jonathan knelt in misery. "Take, for example, the ingenious piece of furniture you're currently enjoying. Are you comfortable?" "No, sir." "Of course you're not," the Admiral spat. "And nor do you deserve to be." He caressed the aged, polished wood with chocolate-stained fingers. "This device is known as the Sinner's Sorrow. She was here even before myself, a lovely leftover from one of Slaphenge's former lives. The Sinner's Sorrow was made all of wood and rose as high as the Admiral's bulging belly. At its base was a rail where Jonathan's knees rested, a long piece of stained wood that was sharpened to a vicious edge that was biting at his flesh like a dull saw blade. At its top was a slanted, flat desktop and an old inkwell. Who knows how many lunatics and criminals have knelt here, paying the price for their evil." The Admiral's eyes, blurry from liquor, lapped hungrily at the wretched wood of the Sinner's Sorrow. His gray tongue licked at his lips. "How does that rail feel on your young knees? It burns, doesn't it?" Jonathan looked up straight into the Admiral's eyes for the first time. "No," he answered in a level voice. "It doesn't burn, sir. It just hurts." The Admiral raised an eyebrow and sniffed. "Yes, well, you would know, wouldn't you, Jonathan Grisby?" Jonathan looked down quickly, stung by the man's words. The Admiral cleared his throat and took a step back. "You're just the latest denegrit to feel her bite, and she is just one of the tools we at Slaphenge will use to educate and civilize and correct. And you will be corrected. A crime as wicked as yours will require quite severe correction." The Admiral leaned close so that Jonathan could feel as well as hear his next words in his ear. "You have done terrible things, haven't you, Jonathan Grisby?" Jonathan lowered his head and didn't answer. The Admiral wheezed out a phlegmy sigh and took a step back. "But all that begins tomorrow. You'll see. You've arrived late. It's nearly all dark time. One little thing remains to be done." He reached for something from his desk and slid it into the Sinner's Sorrow little writing surface, a pen and a blank piece of paper. "At Slabhenge, all of our boys write a letter home to Mommy and Daddy every day to let them know that you are safe and sound and that their investment is paying off. The mail goes out in the morning, and yours is the last letter we need. What do you want me to say?" The Admiral's eyebrows dropped. The corner kid shuffled over and squeezed the back of Jonathan's arm in a hard, vicious pinch. "Sir!" he spat into Jonathan's ear. Jonathan tried to shift from knee to knee to ease the growing pain. "What do you want me to say, sir?" The Admiral turned his hands palm up and spread his fingers. "Whatever you like." Jonathan frowned at the paper and thought of all the things he'd like to say to his parents. "I can't write with my hands cuffed, sir." "Of course not," The Admiral tossed a heavy ring of keys to the chubby kid, who jangled and fumbled behind Jonathan until there was a click and Jonathan felt his hands finally swing free. He rubbed his sore wrists and wriggled his stiff shoulder sockets. With a quick glance at the Admiral, he picked up the pen and scribbled out a few sentences, then folded the paper and handed it to him. The Admiral unfolded the paper. "Dear Mom and Dad," he read aloud. "This place is just as terrible as I deserve. Give my love to Sophia. Jonathan." The Admiral shook his head and clicked his tongue. No, this won't do. Try it again, Jonathan Grisby. You can say whatever you wish, of course, but you cannot speak poorly of our fine institution. We don't want them regretting the difficult decision they made to send you here. So, again, without the parts about Slabhedge." The Admiral slid another blank piece of paper across the desk. "My parents didn't send me here, sir." Jonathan knew that it wouldn't help him at all to argue, but he felt he had to say it. "A judge did." The room hung in taut silence. "Do you think I don't know that?" the Admiral asked, and his voice was darkly low and quiet. Jonathan didn't answer. "Yes, a judge sentenced you to a reformatory for heinous crime. But he gave your parents several choices, did he not? And they chose Slabhedge, did they not?" Jonathan swallowed. All of his trembling parts screamed at him to let it go, but he couldn't. "Yes, sir, but only because it was the cheapest. They had to pay for half, and we don't have—" "Enough!" the Admiral interrupted. He bent down low so Jonathan could look into his shiny, bloodshot eyes. "Everything that I wish or need to know about you and your pathetic life I have already read. You are here because they sent you, and yes, we save money at the same time that we save souls here at Slabhedge, even souls not worth saving. Since I now know how very frugal you are, I shall make extra certain that we don't waste a single unnecessary dime on your care, other than the discipline required to correct your corrupted character. Now, the letter." Jonathan resisted the urge to wipe the spittle off his face that had flown there from the Admiral's mouth. He blinked down at the paper through the sweat that was dripping into his eyes. His knees throbbed. He scrawled another message and handed it to the Admiral. "No," the Admiral said after reading it. All the teasing was gone from his voice. "Longer, more pleasant, and mention our food." "What food, sir?" "Our delicious and nourishing food." "But I haven't had any food, sir, and I'm starving." Jonathan's stomach growled as he spoke. The Admiral ground his teeth and blinked his eyes. "Write the letter, Jonathan Grisby. Then dinner." It took Jonathan 7 tries to write a letter that his Admiral would accept. By the time he was done, his stomach was rumbling loud enough for all three of them to hear, and the boy in the corner was glaring at him with open hatred. The Admiral had gone through 3 more gold-wrapped chocolates. "There," the Admiral said, folding the final letter and slipping it into an envelope. "It shouldn't have been that hard. Awful things happen to boys with awful attitudes." Too late. Jonathan wanted to answer, but he bit his lip and kept his eyes on the cracks between the stone blocks of the floor. His hair dangled down in front of his eyes, and he let it stay. "Brandy," the Admiral said, and Jonathan heard the kid hurry to fill the glass. The Admiral walked to the door and opened it. "Mr. Warwick, show Jonathan Grisby to his quarters." Jonathan's head shot up. "What about dinner?" A pair of rough hands pulled him up from the agony of the sinner's sorrow and yanked him toward the door. The Admiral yawned as Jonathan was paraded past. He held out his hands to stop them, his fingers pressing into Jonathan's chest. He smacked his lips and leaned down to speak into his face. The sour mix of chocolate and liquor on his hot breath made Jonathan's stomach curl. "Do you really think a boy who wastes 6 pieces of paper to write a simple letter deserves to be spoiled with food?" Jonathan's heart sank into his aching belly. The Admiral's eyes slithered to the man who was pushing Jonathan from behind. "No pillow for this one, Mr. Warwick. He doesn't have a brain worth cushioning." "Yes, sir. I will see you in the morning, Jonathan Grisby. Do try to get some sleep. Tomorrow will be a very hard day for you." Well, that's the end of chapter 2, and I don't think I told you what chapter 2 was called, did I? The Sinner's Sorrow. And if you remember what the sinner's sorrow is, it's the contraption he had to kneel on that bit into his knees while he was waiting to write his letter and talking with the admiral. That was kind of a short time to read. I could try to read one more. Shall we? I don't know. Shall we? I think there was not much in that one to get on with. So I think I want to read chapter 3 too. It's called The Hatch. Got on the Admiral's bad side, did ya, you idiot? Mr. Warwick coughed up a mouthful of snot from his lungs and spit it onto the floor. He was guiding Jonathan through a twisting labyrinth of dark hallways and steep, shadowy stairwells. The whole place, floor, walls, stairs, and ceiling, was made of the same huge blocks of gray stone. Their way was lit only by a hissing lantern that swung from Mr. Warwick's outstretched hand. "Y'all do nearly bunch of scum, y' are. The Admiral knows you for what you are, eh?" Jonathan stumbled on a slippery step, and Mr. Warwick jerked him roughly back up at his feet. "Still, you got it better'n some. You get a blanket, at least. More than you deserve, likely." "Lucky me," Jonathan muttered. Mr. Warwick spit again and flicked Jonathan in the ear hard enough to make his eyes burn. "Don't you be getting smart now. Smart gets you nowhere getting round here." "Look, Mr. Warwick, or whatever," Jonathan started, rubbing his ear. "Could I get something to eat? Something small, even a biscuit or an apple or something? I haven't eaten since breakfast." Mr. Warwick scratched between his legs and snorted. "Ah, me heart's just a breaking. Poor little criminal's got I'm an aching tummy." He coughed out a mean, small laugh. Suddenly, he pulled to a stop and grabbed Jonathan's arm. "Ah, now, look here, boy." His voice was tight and breathless. He held up the lantern to show a narrow stairway leading down from the corridor they were in. The stairs curved down and around a corner where they were lost in darkness. A low, rumbling, gurgling sound and the salty, rotten smell of stale seawater wafted up to where Jonathan and his guard stood. A frayed rope stretched as a flimsy gate across the stairway opening. "Don't you never stumble down this wretched staircase, boy," Mr. Warwick whispered, leaning close to Jonathan's face in the yellow lantern light. For the first time, Jonathan saw his wrinkled face and his one puckered, empty eye socket. He shivered and pulled back. "Why, what's down there?" Mr. Warwick's lips pulled back to show a toothless smile. "Why, the hatch, my boy. A door of sorts, and beyond it, death and despair and darkness. It be a door that holds back a monster. Ancient she is, and dark, and hungry, and just barely held back. She's there, though, knocking and waiting and biding her time. Not locked in, boy, but locked out. And not for long, I'd wager." Mr. Warwick stared into Jonathan's face with his one eye for a breathless moment before breaking into a wheezing cackle. "Ah," he said, running his tongue over his toothless gums. "Death himself is your downstairs neighbor. Your room be straight up here with the other no-goods." Mr. Warwick stumbled ahead with the swinging lantern. Jonathan stood for a second longer, his eyes peering past the rope and down the darkened stairs. He knew the morbid Cyclops was just trying to scare him, the new kid, with his ghost stories, and Jonathan was past believing in most kinds of monsters. But up from the stairwell came a thump and a rattle, then a slurping growl. He shivered and hurried from the retreating yellow light. They found a corner, then stopped before a large metal door. At eye level, just above Jonathan's head, was a small rectangular opening crossed with metal bars. Mr. Warwick rapped on the door with his knuckles. The knocking echoed in the cold hallway. Water dripped all around them in the darkness, and there was occasional scurrying off in the shadows. Through the opening in the door came the sound of shuffling footsteps, punctured by the steady thwack of cane hitting the stone floor. A bald forehead and a glaring pair of eyes appeared in the little barred window. "It's I, Mr. Mongley," Mr. Warwick said to the eyes. "I've got me the new one here. No pillow for him either, so you know." The half-face disappeared, and there was a jangling of keys, and the door swung open. Mr. Warwick pushed Jonathan through the doorway and stepped in behind him. Beyond the door was nothing but darkness, but Jonathan could tell from the echoes and the movement of the air that the room was large with a tall ceiling. Besides the smell of ocean and mold and wet stone, there was also There was also here the smell of sweat and bodies, an unmistakable odor of an overused bathroom. The man, who must be Mr. Mongley, stood glaring at him sideways, one shoulder hunched over. He shielded his eyes from the light of the dock. "It's all dark," he rasped. His voice was a scratchy hiss, like the throat was stuffed with cotton. He was wearing the same blue uniform that Mr. Warwick and Mr. Vander had. Without another word, he turned and limped off, thumping away into the darkness on a crooked black cane. Go on, Mr. Warwick grunted, poking Jonathan in the spine. Jonathan's eyes darted around the shifting shadows as he followed the hunched form of Mr. Mongley. There were puddles on the floor here, too, big and small. He could just make out on both sides of him, opening in the walls, large rectangular doorways, each with a lightless room behind it, each blocked with the sturdy metal gate of a jail cell. They were jail cells, he realized, or he reminded himself madhouse cells. They were cells built to hold the criminally insane of the previous century. There were no windows, no torches, not even a single flickering candle. There was no light at all in the room, none except the shifting, swaying light of the lantern behind him. But in that steady light, Jonathan saw a silent face behind each black cell door as they passed it, a pair of hands sometimes gripping the iron bars. The light was too dim and the room too big for him to see any of them clearly, but he knew they could see him walking in the lantern light. He could feel all their eyes on him. Mr. Mongley stopped at a cell door and rattled it open with his ring of keys. He stepped on the side, and Mr. Warwick started to shove Jonathan in. "Wait," he protested. "I can't sleep in here." Mr. Warwick gave him a final push and slammed the metal door. "Then don't," he said through the bars as Mongley turned the key in the lock. "What about a bathroom?" Mr. Warwick raised the lantern and held it through the bars. The cell was narrow. Jonathan could have almost touched both walls with a hand if he stood in the middle. A few feet from the cell door, against the wall, was a single bed on a metal frame covered with a thin, lumpy mattress and one ragged blanket. No pillow, of course, and no window, no chair, no desk, no sink. The only thing in the cell besides the bed was a rusty bucket sitting in the back corner. Mr. Warwick swung the lantern toward the bucket. "That there's your night bathroom. Sleep tight." And Mr. Mongley, "Don't take no talking after all dark. So I'd be keeping your mouth shut tight if I were you. Which I ain't, thank the devil." And with that, the light jerked away and disappeared step by step, leaving Jonathan to stand in thickening, choking blackness. Mr. Mongley's cane tapped away from it. There was the creak of the metal door opening, then a final crashing clang as it slammed shut, taking the last of the night with it. At first there was nothing but silence and absolute darkness. Jonathan could hear his own desperate breathing and the hammering of his heart. A cold draft blew through his cell door and goosebumps popped up on his neck. He wrapped his arms around his body. Water dripped and dropped and dabbled all around, a crazy constant pattering and pittering, and then all around the room he heard a scraping and shuffling sound. He strained his ears and then realized that it was all the other boys, walking back from their cell doors to crawl into their skinny beds. Mixed in was a squinchy squeak of mattress springs as bodies lay down and curled up. He cocked his ear and stepped toward the wall to his right. There had been a watching face in the cell next door, he remembered, but he didn't think he'd heard the sound of footsteps or mattress springs from that cell yet. His closest neighbor might still be standing at his cell door, only a few feet away. Jonathan leaned one hand against the damp stone wall and pressed his face against the bars closest to the wall. "Hey," he whispered as loudly as he dared. "Is anyone there?" There was no response. "Hey," he tried again. There was a sound like a sigh or a breath. He screwed his eyes shut in the darkness and listened harder. "What?" Jonathan asked. "Oh." There was a sigh again, just as faint, but this time Jonathan's ears picked up the sounds inside. "Quieter," the voice whispered, almost impossibly quiet. "Mongley hears everything." "Mongley's gone." "No, he always stays all night." "Quieter." Jonathan shook his head. He couldn't possibly speak any quieter. "What kind of place is this?" he asked. "A bad place. Quieter." A chill shook Jonathan's body. His teeth were starting to chatter. It made the whispering harder. It can't be as bad as it seems. The voice paused before answering, like it wanted to say a lot more than it could, in a smoke-thin whisper. No, it's worse. You'll see tomorrow. The voice breathed at last. Quieter. Jonathan gulped and took a few deep, shaky breaths. Behind him was a cold bed and no pillow, and a bucket he didn't even want to think about. He changed the subject. I'm Jonathan. What's your name? Walter. Do you have any food? Jonathan's hunger got the better of him, and his rumbling belly grabbed him by the throat when he asked the question, raising his voice above the whisper he'd intended. His question came out as a desperate plea. It echoed, just barely, in the dark cavern in the room. Somewhere off in the darkness, Jonathan heard a grunt. Then, coming closer through the darkness, the tapping of a cane. Beside him he heard Walter scuttle back to his bed. Jonathan held tight to the metal bars, eyes wide, his head rotating from side to side, seeing nothing. The tapping came closer and closer, straight toward him. Finally it stopped. In the echoing stone chamber, Jonathan couldn't tell where it had stopped, in the middle of the room or inches away. He waited, breathless. There was a whoosh and another grunt, and then Jonathan was hit by a shocking surge of freezing water. It hit him full in the face and drenched his clothes. His breath was sucked from his lungs by the frigid water. No talking, Mr. Mongley hissed like a dying rattlesnake. Jonathan gasped and coughed, his body racked by violent shivering. The next bucket won't be water. The cane tapped away, quieter and quieter, and then finally fell silent. Jonathan stood shivering, his teeth rattling. Then he turned and felt his way back to his bed. He eased down onto the mattress. It was about as thin as a folded-up newspaper, and just about as soft. He pulled the scratchy blanket around his soggy self and curled into a shaking ball. Something snuffled and squeaked under his bed. He blinked in blackness and tried not to imagine a day that could be any worse than the one he had just had. He bit his lip and ran his fingers over the skin of his arms. After a few moments, his thoughts were no longer of himself or his cold or his hunger. Shivering alone in the black, his thoughts were for Sophia. And his silent tears, where at last they came, were for her too. So that is 2 chapters more for us to think about. Poor Jonathan Grimsby in this terrible place. And the chapter was called The Hatch. Got to meet a few more characters briefly. Mr. Warwick, the Admiral, Mr. Warwick. I always go over, sometimes when I read something, what is it I just read? Especially when you read out loud. I mean, I find myself, I'm reading out loud, even listening. But reading to yourself is the best to me, to remember what I read. I really get into it when I read to myself, and that's what you should be doing, as well as maybe listening to my book, or our book. But this gets better. It's the beginning is just introducing, and most books are like that. They sometimes start off a little bit slow. It's not exactly slow, but it's getting you into the characters and the plot and what's going on, and the mood. And the mood is not what you call happy this time, but he is recognizing where he is and that he's got to obey the rules, doesn't he? But we learn now about a person we don't know anything about much, Sophia. And we'll learn more about Sophia. And the poor kid is going to bed, soaking wet and hungry on a crummy mattress in a crummy cell. And the next time I see you, we will read chapter 4. And it's called A Dark Tale to Be Sure. Until next time, happy reading to yourself, happy time with your families and doing things. Enjoy the book. And you can listen to it again if you didn't understand it, which is also something you can do. Bye.